The gentle slopes along the Little Bighorn River in Montana preserve the echoes of one of America's most renowned and sorrowful conflicts. On June 25 to 26, 1876, the U.S. 7th Cavalry, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, faced a catastrophic loss against Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters. Known as the Battle of the Little Bighorn, this clash has been narrated for over a century as a tale of valor and sacrifice. Yet contemporary studies unveil a grimmer, more intricate story marked by fear, missteps, and a frantic struggle to survive. For decades, it was widely held that Custer and his troops courageously battled to their final moments, holding their position against a formidable foe. This notion was reinforced through literature, films, and patriotic accounts depicting Custer as an intrepid commander who never surrendered. However, this portrayal is far from the truth. If Custer was such an adept cavalry leader, why did he and his men suffer such a crushing defeat? The conventional reasoning was that they were heavily outnumbered, but in truth Custer committed grave errors. He misjudged the resilience and resolve of the native warriors and made flawed strategic choices. Rather than an organized last stand, the battle was a disordered slaughter, with troops dispersed, terrified, and frantically attempting to flee. Modern archaeology has shed light on the true events of that day. Employing forensic methods akin to crime scene analysis, scholars have examined spent cartridges, skeletal remains, and battlefield layouts to construct a more precise narrative. The findings indicate that the battle was not a singular confrontation in one spot, but a series of smaller skirmishes across a vast area. Custer's forces were not maintaining a cohesive defense. They were isolated, overwhelmed in small units, and systematically vanquished by native warriors who outnumbered them.
Bullet trajectories suggest that many soldiers did not fight to their last round, but instead tried to escape.
The famed last stand at Last Stand Hill was likely one of the concluding moments of an already doomed battle, with soldiers making a frantic but futile effort to regroup. Despite the stark reality, the myth of Custer's bravery persists in retellings. Each year, the town of Hardin, Montana reenacts the battle, often amplifying the gallantry of Custer and his men while minimizing the true history. Hollywood has significantly contributed to perpetuating this legend, portraying Custer as a fearless, self-sacrificing commander rather than a leader who made fatal blunders. For the Native American tribes who fought at Little Bighorn, Custer was not a heroic figure, but an invader spearheading a campaign to seize their lands.
Yet, he was recast as a tragic war hero in American lore.
Prior to the battle, Custer was celebrated for his exploits in the Civil War, known for his flamboyant demeanor and bold, sometimes impulsive tactics.
His dramatic demise only amplified his legend.
With no survivors from his immediate command, people could envision his final moments as they pleased, crafting the narrative into one of noble sacrifice rather than a catastrophe. The U.S. government and media swiftly transformed Custer's defeat into a story of courage and honor at a time when the nation was still healing from the Civil War.
The image of a valiant cavalry officer battling against insurmountable odds was compelling.
However, this version of history largely overlooked the accounts of those who were present, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who triumphed in the battle. For years, the testimonies of Native American warriors who fought in the battle were disregarded or dismissed. Yet their oral traditions convey a starkly different account: disorder, confusion, and panic among the cavalry, with no grandiose last stand. Joseph Medicine Crow, a historian and the last war chief of the Crow Nation, shared stories handed down from his grandfather, White Man Runs Him, who had served as one of Custer's scouts. According to these narratives, the battle was so expansive that no single individual could have observed everything. Still, a consistent theme emerged. Custer's men were overwhelmed and slaughtered in a chaotic retreat rather than mounting a heroic final defense.
Lakota and Cheyenne witnesses noted that Custer's troops were fatigued, outmaneuvered, and demoralized long before the final clash.
Some soldiers reportedly discarded their weapons and attempted to flee on foot, only to be struck down.
Others were so disoriented that they fired erratically, squandering ammunition. These accounts challenge the image of disciplined soldiers holding their ground until the last round.
For decades, these native testimonies were largely ignored because they clashed with the patriotic narrative. However, modern forensic research is increasingly corroborating these accounts, confirming that Custer's troops were likely in disarray long before the battle concluded. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was not an isolated event.
It was part of a broader campaign to subdue the northern plains tribes and confine them to reservations. By the mid-1870s, Native American resistance was viewed as a barrier to westward expansion, and the U.S. government sought to eliminate that threat. Sitting Bull, a revered Lakota leader, recognized that this was a fight for survival. He rallied various Lakota and Cheyenne bands to unite in one final stand against the U.S. military. His famous words, often paraphrased as "Come to my camp for the last great fight. It will be a good day to die," reflect the resolve of Native warriors to defend their way of life. In the battle's aftermath, the bodies of Custer and his men were discovered where they fell, their locations marked by makeshift burials. Today, white marble markers dot the battlefield, commemorating the fallen soldiers in the precise spots where they perished. The most notable site is Last Stand Hill, where roughly 40 markers cluster together, reinforcing the traditional tale of a heroic final stand. However, as one traverses the battlefield, a different picture emerges. Scattered markers stretch across miles of terrain, suggesting that many soldiers were attempting to flee rather than holding their ground. The trail of death leads a deep ravine where numerous bodies were found in a last desperate bid for escape. For many years, people have debated what transpired when Native American warriors defeated Custer and his men. We now have a clearer understanding of the battle thanks to archaeologists Douglas Scott and Richard Fox. By examining bullets, bones, and other artifacts left behind, they have reconstructed the true story of Custer's last stand. Archaeologists treat historic battlefields like crime scenes. Every bullet, piece of equipment, or bone they uncover provides insight into what occurred. Even though the soldiers who died cannot share their stories, their remains offer critical clues. One of the most significant discoveries was near marker 128, where archaeologists unearthed the bones of a young soldier, likely aged 19 to 21. His injuries revealed the battle's brutality. His jaw was shattered so severely that his teeth were broken in half. His collarbone bore deep cuts, likely from a knife, and his leg bones showed signs of being struck with an axe. The soldier had also been shot multiple times. A bullet was found lodged in his wrist, and there were gunshot wounds in his chest. Some of these shots were likely fired from a distance, but as the battle drew closer, it appears the attackers delivered a final blow to the head. This discovery demonstrated that Native American warriors were not only wielding traditional weapons like knives and axes, but also possessed firearms. Another skeleton helped archaeologists identify a specific soldier. His bones revealed a gunshot wound in the hip, with tiny metal fragments embedded within. This type of injury would have been fatal in the 1870s, as medical technology was insufficient to treat severe abdominal wounds. Records from the battle indicate that a soldier named Vincent Charlie was found dead with a hip wound and a gruesome detail. A stick had been forced down his throat. Due to this shocking detail, archaeologists believe these remains belonged to him. His bones narrate the story of his tragic demise and the battle's ferocity. Since no photographs of Vincent Charlie exist, forensic artist Betty Pat Gatliff has worked to reconstruct his face, a technique often used in criminal investigations to identify victims. Though we know Vincent Charlie's identity, reconstructing his face helps us connect with the past in a more human way. The battle arose because the U.S. government sought to force Native American tribes onto reservations. On May 17, 1876, 3 columns of soldiers entered Montana to confront these tribes. Custer's task was to locate them. On June 25th, his scouts spotted a large Native American village near the Little Bighorn River. One scout, White Man Runs Him, cautioned Custer that the number of warriors was overwhelming, but Custer disregarded the warning and prepared to attack. Instead of keeping his forces united, Custer divided his 600 men into 3 groups, weakening their position. He sent Captain Benteen south, ordered Major Reno to assault the village, and led 210 men toward the hills. When he finally saw the full extent of the village, he realized it was far larger than anticipated. Over 1,500 warriors were ready to fight. Witnesses reported that his face paled upon seeing the camp size. Even after his scouts urged him to wait for reinforcements, he pressed forward. As Reno's assault faltered and Benteen's group was too distant to assist, Custer and his men found themselves trapped and outnumbered. Just before the final battle, Custer instructed his scouts to leave, knowing they would perish if they remained. His interpreter, Mitch Boyer, translated his final warning. "Boys, you better get away from here as fast as possible. I'm stuck." One of the few survivors was White Man Runs Him,
the grandfather of historian Joseph Medicine Crow. He escaped a battle and later passed down what he had witnessed. Meanwhile, Custer and his men rode into history, meeting their tragic fate. Over a century later, archaeologists arrived at the battlefield with metal detectors. The first day of exploration yielded remarkable finds: bullets, spent cartridges, and even fragments of personal gear. These discoveries helped map out where soldiers fired their weapons and where they fell. One key finding was spent cartridges from Henry rifles, high-quality repeating rifles used by native warriors. These were superior to the single-shot Springfield carbines carried by Custer's men, giving the native warriors a significant edge. Another discovery was a wedding band still on a soldier's finger bone. This small object served as a poignant reminder that these men were not merely soldiers. They were husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers. Their deaths were not only a military loss, but a personal tragedy for their families. Douglas Scott and Richard Fox's research has provided a clearer, more accurate version of history. Scientists have uncovered thousands of bullets, cartridge cases, and other artifacts from the battlefield. By studying them, they've mapped out the movements of soldiers and warriors, revealing where they fought, where they fell, and how their weapons were used. Each bullet and shell casing found at Little Bighorn was meticulously cataloged, recorded, and added to a digital map of the battlefield. This helped researchers reconstruct the events of the fight. Even today, much remains buried beneath the ground, awaiting discovery. One remarkable find was a .45 caliber Springfield carbine round near Last Stand Hill. This bullet was unfired and perfectly preserved, even after over 125 years. It was a rare discovery, but not uncommon. Soldiers in battle often dropped bullets due to stress, confusion, or weapon malfunctions. The U.S. Army equipped the 7th Cavalry with .45 caliber Springfield carbines and pistols, making it easy to identify their ammunition. However, archaeologists also found hundreds of other bullets that didn't match these weapons. These bullets had to have come from Native American warriors' firearms. By examining where different bullets were found, scientists could discern how the battle unfolded. Trooper bullets were discovered near Native American positions, while Native American bullets were found at soldier positions. This pattern revealed where each side was shooting from and provided valuable insights into their movements. One of the most surprising discoveries was the volume of Native American bullets and cartridge cases. Historians once believed most Native warriors fought with bows and arrows, but battlefield evidence proved otherwise. Researchers found that at least 47 different types of firearms were used by Native warriors, including muzzleloaders, old flintlocks, and advanced repeating rifles. This meant that over 800 warriors were armed with guns, outgunning Custer's men 4-1. How did Native warriors acquire so many firearms? The answer lies in trade. Native Americans purchased or bartered for guns from trading posts, fur traders, and even captured them from soldiers. They favored lightweight, rapid-firing weapons like the 1866 Winchester repeating rifle, which allowed them to shoot quickly, almost like firing arrows. Some warriors modified their firearms, shortening barrels to make them easier to wield in close combat. Revolvers were also popular because they were lightweight, portable, and could fire multiple rounds rapidly. While bullets told part of the story, the real insights came from the cartridge cases. When a firearm is discharged, it leaves unique marks on the cartridge case, akin to a fingerprint. By matching these marks, scientists could determine if two bullets were fired from the same gun, even if found far apart on the battlefield. Archaeologist Douglas Scott analyzed over 1,500 cartridge cases and discovered that some bore identical markings but were found hundreds of yards apart. This indicated that the same firearm had been used in different locations. For example, one matching set of cartridge cases was found at Calhoun Hill and Last Stand Hill, about a quarter-mile apart. This suggested that either a soldier had fled across the battlefield with the gun, or, more likely, the firearm had been seized by a native warrior and used against the 7th Cavalry. For a long time, it was believed that Native American warriors primarily used bows and arrows and won due to their numerical superiority. However, archaeological evidence revealed otherwise. The native warriors possessed a significant advantage in firepower and employed a variety of weapons to defeat Custer's men. Custer's troops were both outgunned and outnumbered. They fought valiantly but faced warriors with more firearms, ammunition, and superior battlefield tactics than history once suggested.
Instead of remaining stationary and trading gunfire, Native American warriors fought in a manner that made them elusive targets. They concealed themselves behind natural barriers like ridges and gullies, briefly emerging to fire a shot, then relocating before the soldiers could retaliate. This made them difficult to hit and enabled them to encircle Custer's men from multiple directions. Bullets from the same weapons were found in several locations, indicating that warriors were constantly on the move. This gave them a substantial advantage over the 7th Cavalry, whose soldiers adhered to more rigid and predictable tactics. Custer's troops were not the elite, highly trained soldiers some accounts portray. Many were young, inexperienced, and physically unfit for combat. Most were immigrants from Ireland, England, and Germany seeking a better life in America. Their diet was inadequate, and they suffered from ailments like arthritis and dental decay, despite being in their 20s. By the time they reached Little Bighorn, they were exhausted, having traveled on horseback for months with little rest. They were ill-prepared for a fast-paced battle. This lack of stamina and physical strength likely compounded their difficulty in responding to the warriors' swift attacks. Custer's battle plan involved dividing his forces into 3 groups. His group advanced toward the river, while another, led by Captain Miles Keogh, remained on higher ground. As Custer's troops moved, they encountered some resistance, but initially the fighting was not intense. Most Native American warriors were still engaged with another group of U.S. soldiers under Major Reno to the south. However, as Native women and children fled north, Custer and his 210 men pursued them. Meanwhile, Keogh and his 120 soldiers held their position near a small hill. The battle remained long-range, with soldiers and warriors exchanging fire from a distance. But the tide soon turned against Custer's troops. Custer's men were trained to fight using a skirmish line tactic. Upon arriving at the battlefield, they would dismount and spread out in a long line, standing about 5 yards apart. 3 out of every 4 soldiers would prepare to fire, while the 4th held their horses slightly back. This strategy was designed to make the soldiers harder to hit while maintaining organized firepower. However, this tactic was effective in conventional battles but ineffective against warriors who fought unpredictably. Native American fighters did not attack head-on. They approached from all directions, swiftly moving behind ridges and hills to evade gunfire. By analyzing bullet locations, archaeologists found evidence that some of Custer's soldiers attempted to form a skirmish line on Calhoun Hill, but this defensive position collapsed quickly. Native American warriors climbed onto a ridge and fired down on the soldiers, who had no cover. The scattered remains of cartridge cases indicate that the soldiers were swiftly overwhelmed and had no time to reposition. The Native American warriors prevailed because they were faster, used the terrain strategically, and fought in a way Custer's men were unprepared for. Instead of remaining stationary like the soldiers, they kept moving, making themselves harder to hit. They leveraged ridges, gullies, and hills to stay concealed while firing. Meanwhile, exhausted and ill-equipped, Custer's soldiers clung to outdated tactics that failed in this type of combat. Their skirmish lines and defensive positions could not stop the fast-moving warriors, and their lack of mobility made them easy targets. Native American warriors did not require orders from a commander to act. They were natural hunters and fighters, trained from youth to track, stalk, and strike with speed and precision. Whether hunting buffalo or engaging in tribal conflicts, they honed instincts that made them formidable in battle. They fought up close, using weapons designed for hand-to-hand combat. Their lances, war clubs, tomahawks, and bows enabled swift and effective strikes. Even when using firearms, they often preferred traditional weapons for their efficiency in close quarters. Horsemanship was a significant advantage for native warriors. They could hang off the side of their horses for protection while attacking enemies on the ground. They aimed to disarm opponents by targeting their wrists and then delivering a lethal blow to the head. Their fighting style was rapid, aggressive, and unpredictable. Instead of fighting the whole ground, they employed hit-and-run tactics to weaken and disorient their enemies. In contrast, the U.S. cavalry fought in a highly structured manner. Soldiers were trained to follow strict orders, move in formations, and rely on firearms like carbines and pistols for long-range combat. Their training was rooted in European-style warfare, effective against organized armies but ill-suited for the fast-moving native warriors. A major flaw in cavalry tactics was their dependence on horses. When fighting on foot, they lost their speed and became vulnerable. Additionally, since some soldiers had to hold the horses, a unit lost 1/4 of its firepower upon dismounting. Another issue was that cavalry soldiers were not trained to think independently in battle. Accustomed to following orders, many were at a loss when their formations broke down. Unlike native warriors, who could adapt instantly, cavalry soldiers often panicked when plans unraveled. The U.S. Army was trained to confront enemies like the French or Prussians, organized armies adhering to conventional rules of war. But native warriors fought differently. They did not stand in orderly lines or wait to be fired upon. Instead, they attacked from unexpected angles, retreated when necessary, and used the terrain to their advantage. The Army's rigid approach left them unprepared for this type of combat. Officers were slow to adapt, and soldiers struggled when out of formation. The cavalry was at a significant disadvantage in open battles where speed and adaptability were critical. A clear example of these issues occurred during the Battle of the Little Bighorn. As native warriors attacked, Captain Miles Keogh and his men attempted to hold their position, but their standard tactics failed. The soldiers could not match the warriors' speed and intensity, and their lines soon disintegrated. About 40 cavalrymen tried to escape, but the warriors swiftly counterattacked and forced them back. As panic set in, the soldiers lost all sense of order. Native accounts described them firing wildly into the air instead of aiming at their enemies. Archaeological evidence confirms what happened next. When soldiers were still following orders, their spent bullets were found in neat lines, indicating they were fighting in formation. But in other areas, bullets were scattered in tight clusters, showing that soldiers were bunching together in fear rather than maintaining their positions. This was a fatal error. Unlike native warriors who could fight independently and survive as separated, cavalrymen relied on formations for protection. Once they panicked and clustered, they became easy targets. The warriors capitalized on this, closing in and finishing them off. Another challenge for the cavalry was the mix of soldiers on horseback and on foot. Those on foot were slower and more vulnerable, while those on horses could not easily assist them. This made it difficult for the cavalry to function as a cohesive unit. At Calhoun Hill, this weakness became evident as the right wing collapsed. Soldiers attempted to flee, but the warriors quickly pursued and attacked. Because they were not moving together, some tried to reach Custer's left wing, but the battle was already lost. The archaeological evidence illustrates the desperation of the final moments. Captain Keogh's company I made its last stand at Calhoun Hill, but the overwhelming number of native warriors left them with little chance. The spent bullets at the site reveal a one-sided fight. A few shots from the soldiers, contrasted with an abundance of native bullets. The last survivors of the right wing fled toward Custer's left wing, but they were swiftly surrounded and eliminated. The battle had become a massacre, with native warriors leveraging their superior tactics and close combat skills to annihilate the cavalry. Native American warriors who witnessed the battle described it as a one-sided slaughter. They observed soldiers firing erratically in all directions, some feigning death in hopes of being spared. One warrior likened it to a buffalo stampede, chaos as the soldiers fled for their lives. For years, historians believed the positions of fallen soldiers indicated an organized skirmish line. However, the Custer shaped this idea, portraying them as brave men holding their ground until the last bullet. The reality is far grimmer. By the time Custer's men reached their final position, they had already lost half their force. A key factor in the battle's outcome was the weaponry. The 7th Cavalry was equipped with the 1873 Springfield carbine, a powerful but slow-loading rifle effective at long ranges, up to 700 yards, but limited to a few rounds per minute. The native warriors, however, wielded Henry repeating rifles capable of firing up to 10 shots in seconds. While these rifles were most effective within 200 yards, that was sufficient once the warriors closed in. The cavalry faced serious trouble. Archaeologists found evidence that the native warriors had at least 200 repeating rifles. Early in the fight, the cavalry held the advantage with their long-range Springfields, but the repeating rifles proved superior as the warriors drew nearer. This explains the rapid collapse of Custer's right wing. Unable to match the warriors' rapid fire, the soldiers were gunned down as they attempted to retreat. Of the 210 men, only 105 reached Custer's final position on Last Stand Hill. By the time the survivors joined Custer, half the original force was gone. Any hope of victory was lost. The soldiers shifted from attack to defense, but they were encircled. To worsen matters, native warriors had seized Springfield carbines from fallen soldiers, turning these weapons against Custer's remaining men, making the fight even more uneven. At some point, a group of 40 soldiers on foot, along with 5 to 9 mounted riders, attempted to flee toward the river, but Crazy Horse and his warriors had already sealed off the battlefield.
The soldiers never reached safety.
Realizing escape was their only option, some troopers discarded their weapons and ran toward the river, but they were surrounded. A Northern Cheyenne warrior named Big Beaver later recounted the final moments. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors came from all sides.
We had them surrounded. In a little while they were all dead. When the battle ended, no soldier in Custer's immediate command survived.
Last Stand Hill became their final resting place, with markers below tracing their failed escape to Deep Ravine.
When reinforcements arrived 2 days later, they encountered a horrific scene.
Of the 268 U.S. soldiers killed, only 56 could be identified. The bodies were not merely left on the battlefield, they were brutally mutilated.
Warriors had slit throats, severed limbs, and taken scalps.
Some soldiers had their eyes removed, and others were mutilated in ways intended to prevent their souls from reaching the afterlife, according to certain native spiritual beliefs.
These acts were not solely about vengeance. They were tied to cultural practices of warfare.
Years later, archaeologists examined the remains of Custer's men and found clear evidence of brutal violence. One skull bore gunshot wounds from the back and top, likely from a soldier attempting to flee or executed at close range.
Deep knife marks on bones indicated that some men were scalped. Others had been struck with tomahawks or war clubs, shattering their skulls.
A particularly disturbing find was knife marks inside an eye socket, confirming that an eye had been forcibly removed.
These injuries paint a grim picture of the final moments. The battle was not just a fight, it was a massacre. Even after more than a century, some fallen soldiers have been identified.
One set of facial bones near markers 32 and 33 provided enough clues to determine the soldier's identity.
The remains included the nose, upper teeth, and part of the left eye socket. Tooth wear suggested the individual was a pipe smoker.
Notably, the facial bones indicated a blend of Native American and European ancestry, uncommon among Custer's troops.
After thorough analysis, historians concluded that the remains likely belonged to Mitch Boyer, Custer's scout. He had warned Custer about the large native force, but his advice was ignored. He perished alongside the cavalrymen he tried to protect.
That unfired bullet found on Last Stand Hill is more than a relic. It tells a compelling story. Picture a young soldier, newly arrived from New York, suddenly thrust into one of the most terrifying battles of the American West.
As warriors closed in, he tried to reload his Springfield carbine, hands trembling with fear. But before he could fire, he was struck down.
That bullet remained in the chamber, and nearly 150 years later, it stands as silent testimony to his final moments.
Mitch Boyer was a skilled scout, part French and part Sioux.
He recognized the dangers and reportedly advised Custer against attacking the massive Native American village. Custer ignored him, but some believe Boyer urged other scouts to escape before it was too late. This includes a story from Joseph Medicine Crow's family, who say his grandfather survived due to a scout's warning. Could that scout have been Boyer? Boyer remained with Custer's men until the end. His remains, possibly identified by a matching bone fragment, were found near Deep Ravine.
Deep Ravine remains an enigma.
Native American accounts claim that 28 soldiers died in Deep Ravine and were buried there, but their graves have never been found. Tall Bull, a Northern Cheyenne warrior who fought in the battle, described the final moments. I heard a big war whoop.
The soldiers were coming. They ran right through us into Deep Ravine, and this was the last of the fight. The men were killed in this gully, so the last fighting was not on Last Stand Hill. I saw soldiers start running down the hill toward us. Nearly all of them were afraid.
Some were so scared they shot their guns in the air. This contrasts sharply with the narrative of Custer and his men standing their ground on a hill. Instead, it suggests they panicked and fled, attempting to escape but were killed in Deep Ravine.
Other warriors, like Iron Hawk, provided similar accounts.
Archaeologists have found native bullet shells along the sides of Deep Ravine, indicating that warriors were firing down at soldiers trying to hide or escape. If so many soldiers died there, why haven't their bodies been found? Some historians believe they were buried in an unmarked grave.
Others think time and nature scattered their remains. The truth remains elusive.
The Battle of the Little Bighorn was not a glorious fight. It was brutal. Many men on both sides perished.
While Custer's soldiers were annihilated, the Native Americans' victory was short-lived. Within a year, the U.S. Army returned with greater force, compelling the Lakota and Cheyenne onto reservations.
Ultimately, the true last stand was not Custer's, but the Native Americans. They won the battle, but lost their way of life.
One of the soldiers who died was Vincent Charlie, a Swiss immigrant. He was taller and older than most, many of whom were young men with little experience. By reconstructing his face from his skull, historians have given a name to one of the men who fought and died at Little Bighorn.
It reminds us that these soldiers were not just numbers, but individuals with stories. Vincent Charlie's remains are now interred at the Little Bighorn battlefield with his comrades.
Custer's body was relocated to West Point, but more than 50 Native warriors and many Native women and children also perished in the battle.
Their sacrifices are now being acknowledged through modern research. The Battle of the Little Bighorn marked a turning point.
The Lakota and Cheyenne triumphed that day, but it was their final major victory.
The U.S. government deployed more troops, crushed Native resistance, and forced them off their lands. Today, the battlefield serves as a poignant reminder of this history.
The mystery of Deep Ravine remains unresolved, and the truth about Mitch Boyer is still debated. But one thing is certain. This was not merely Custer's last stand, it was the last stand of an entire way of life.